You watched the movie, you thought you knew the story, but behind the curtain, buried in sealed documents and censored footage, lies something far more disturbing than Hollywood dared to show. Chapter 1. The film that shook the internet when Sound of Freedom hit theaters in 2023. No one expected what came next. The film, which tells the story of a government agent rescuing children from traffickers, exploded across social media. It started with quiet praise in certain circles, then spread like wildfire. Within days, it was trending. Within weeks, it was a cultural lightning rod. People weren't just watching the movie, they were treating it like a movement. What was the film about? Sound of Freedom follows a man named Tim Ballard, a fictionalized version of a real person, as he leaves his government job to save a child from traffickers in Latin America. The movie shows him tracking down organized rings, breaking into enemy territory, and risking his life to rescue the innocent. It's intense, emotional, visually gripping. The message is clear. Trafficking is real, and heroes are fighting it. At first glance, it seemed like a story everyone could support. Who wouldn't want to see children saved? Who wouldn't cheer for someone standing up to such evil? But as it reached more people, questions began to rise. Why did it go viral? Part of the film's success came from its message. It touched something raw in the public psyche, the idea that evil exists, and it's targeting the most vulnerable. It resonated with parents, with church groups, with online communities already concerned about child safety and corruption. It wasn't just a movie, it became a symbol. People started using phrases like "God's children are not for sale," a line from the film as a rallying cry. It was printed on shirts, posted in memes, shouted at rallies. For some, it became more than entertainment. It felt like truth-telling, but not everyone agreed with how that truth was told. Early criticism. As the film gained momentum, critics began speaking up, not about the problem of trafficking, that's real and horrifying, but about how the film told its story. Some said it was overly dramatic, that it simplified a very complex issue, turning it into a good guys versus bad guys narrative. Others pointed out that the movie leaned heavily on emotional shock rather than facts, that it focused on child abduction in faraway countries, when in reality, many trafficking victims are manipulated, not kidnapped, and many never leave their own city. More voices joined in, journalists, former agents, even survivors. They said the movie left out key details, that it painted a fantasy version of rescue, one that rarely happens in real life. And then, there were the religious undertones. Subtle messaging. If you watch closely, Sound of Freedom carries a quiet spiritual thread. Prayers whispered in dark moments. Biblical language, a sense that the hero is chosen, not just brave, but on a divine mission. That's not necessarily wrong, but it raised eyebrows, especially when people learned who was funding the movie. Behind the scenes were several Christian groups, some tied to large churches, others with connections to far-right media. A few even had histories of promoting conspiracy theories. Suddenly, Sound of Freedom wasn't just that trafficking movie, it was a statement, a political flag. Some praised it louder, others pulled back. So, what was really going on? Backers and politics looking deeper. It became clear this wasn't a typical Hollywood film. It was backed by Angel Studios, a company known for crowd-funded faith-based projects like The Chosen. The marketing strategy was bold. Instead of traditional ads, the filmmakers encouraged fans to pay it forward, buying tickets for strangers, spreading the word through churches and social media. It worked, but this approach also blurred the line between storytelling and activism. The film's lead actor, Jim Caviezel, known for playing Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, added fuel to the fire. In interviews, he referenced real-world conspiracies and talked about spiritual warfare. This pushed the film even further into controversial territory, and yet, the box office numbers kept climbing. By the end of its run, Sound of Freedom had outperformed major studio films. It shocked industry insiders. It became a rallying point for people who believed Hollywood was hiding the truth. But here's the part no one wants to talk about. Some of the darkest truths, the ones that would have made people really uncomfortable. They were never shown. The tip of the iceberg. Yes, child trafficking is real. Yes, it's global. Yes, it's evil. But the version shown in Sound of Freedom is only a sliver of reality, a version that's safe enough to sell tickets, but not so harsh that it scares people away. What about the cases involving powerful institutions? What about victims who weren't saved by heroes, but were ignored by systems that protected their abusers? What about the real survivors who said their stories were stolen, reshaped, or used for someone else's fame? Those stories didn't make it to the screen. They were edited out, sanitized, or never included in the first place. And that brings us to the real question. Was it done to protect the audience, or to protect something else? Setting the stage as we dig deeper into the stories that were left out. Keep this in mind. Movies are not reality. They are shaped, polished, and packaged. But when a movie claims to reveal the truth, especially about something as serious as trafficking, it has a responsibility. A responsibility not just to entertain, but to inform. Sound of Freedom opened a door. But what lies beyond that door is far more disturbing. And in the chapters to come, we're going to explore what got left behind, who made those choices, and why. Because if we really want to help the victims, we have to be willing to look at the whole picture, even the parts no one wants to see. Chapter 2. The real cases. The film skipped Sound of Freedom told one kind of story, but it wasn't the whole story. The truth is, child trafficking isn't just about secret jungle raids or kids being rescued at the last second. The real cases, the ones that keep professionals awake at night, are often quieter, messier, and more painful. They don't look like the movies, and that's why they're often ignored. In this chapter, we're going to explore what didn't make it into the film, the real-world cases, the silenced survivors, the powerful people no one talks about, and the uncomfortable reason why these stories were left out. A different kind of victim. In the movie, the main child victim is kidnapped in broad daylight and sold across borders. The hero chases her to the edge of the jungle and fights to bring her home. It's dramatic, cinematic. But for many trafficking victims, especially in the United States, it's not how it happens. Many aren't kidnapped. They're groomed. It starts with someone they trust. A boyfriend, a relative, a teacher, or even a neighbor. Slowly, they're manipulated, isolated, controlled. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years. By the time the abuse is happening, the victim often doesn't realize they're being trafficked. They think they're in love, or that they owe someone a debt, or that they're to blame. This is what professionals call coercive control. It's hard to detect, hard to prove, and even harder to explain to the public, which is why movies rarely show it. But it's real, and it affects thousands of kids every year. The cases close to home. You might think trafficking only happens in faraway places, but it happens in quiet suburbs, big cities, and small towns across North America. Let's talk about one case. In 2015, a 15-year-old girl in Ohio went missing. Her parents thought she had run away with friends. In truth, she had been targeted by an older man online. He promised her love, money, and a better life. Within days, she was being trafficked out of hotel rooms by men twice her age. No dramatic rescue came. She was eventually picked up in a police sting operation, arrested for prostitution. She was treated like a criminal, not a victim. It took months for the truth to come out. By then, the damage was deep. Trauma, addiction, a lost childhood. Her story never made headlines. No movie was made. No crowdfunded campaign went viral. And that's the pattern. Where the system fails, many real victims fall through the cracks. They report abuse, but no one believes them. They escape only to be forced back. Or they end up in the foster system, where predators sometimes wait inside the very institutions meant to protect them. A 2020 report from the FBI noted that a significant number of child trafficking victims in the US had previously been in foster care. Let that sink in. The system that's supposed to help often becomes part of the pipeline, and yet, Sound of Freedom never touches this. There's no mention of systemic failure, no look at broken institutions, no focus on how survivors often fight alone. Why? Because those stories are complicated and painful, and they don't sell as easily. The survivors no one called. When the film was first promoted, many survivors of trafficking came forward, some with praise, others with serious concerns. They weren't invited to screenings. They weren't asked for input. Some said their experiences were co-opted, taken without permission, repackaged for the screen, and stripped of truth. One survivor, speaking anonymously to a journalist, said this: "They turned our trauma into action scenes, but the hardest part was never the rescue. It was what happened after. The years of rebuilding, the guilt, the silence. That silence is deafening." And it's why many advocates warned that Sound of Freedom might do more harm than good, by giving people the illusion that something was being done, when in reality, nothing had changed. The cases that disappeared. Now we come to the most disturbing part. There are trafficking cases involving high-profile figures, politicians, CEOs, celebrities, that were quietly buried. The Jeffrey Epstein case is one of the most famous examples. A wealthy financier who trafficked underage girls to powerful men. For years, the system protected him, and when he was finally caught, he died under suspicious circumstances in prison. No major studio has turned that story into a full-length film. No Hollywood actor has portrayed his victim's bravery. Why not? Because when trafficking touches power, real power, the cameras look away. And that's where Sound of Freedom stops short. It shows one version of trafficking, then walks away before it has to name names. What the film didn't say, let's be clear. Raising awareness is important. The movie did get people talking. It started conversations. That matters. But awareness without accuracy can be dangerous. When people think trafficking only looks like dark alleyways and secret compounds, they miss the signs happening right next door. When they think every victim is saved by a hero with a gun, they overlook the survivors sitting silently in classrooms, workplaces, or shelters. And when they believe the only villains are nameless men in faraway jungles, they ignore the predators in plain sight, the ones wearing suits, or uniforms, or preaching from stages. That's the part that Sound of Freedom skipped. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real. A broader truth. So what's the lesson here? Movies are powerful, but they're not truth by default. They're versions of truth, shaped by who's telling the story, and why. The real fight against trafficking isn't just dramatic rescues, it's funding shelters, training social workers, fixing broken systems, listening to survivors. None of that fits neatly into a 2-hour runtime, but it matters. And if we care about the victims, really care, then we have to look beyond the screen. We have to ask harder questions, tell harder stories, and stop pretending that awareness alone is enough. Chapter 3. Footage that was buried. Sound of Freedom was released to thunderous applause, especially among those hungry for a film that revealed the truth behind child trafficking. But here's something most viewers didn't notice. There were interviews that were suddenly pulled offline, deleted behind-the-scenes clips, media appearances that were recorded, then disappeared. Was it censorship? Was it strategy? Or was someone trying to control the narrative? In this chapter, we're digging into the missing footage, the clips and conversations that were quietly erased, and what that says about the people behind the project. Because sometimes, what's not shown tells you more than what is. The promo that vanished. In early 2023, just before the theatrical release, Sound of Freedom's marketing campaign was everywhere. Podcasts, YouTube interviews, press junkets. The film's lead actor, Jim Caviezel, was doing rounds to promote the movie. But one interview stood out, and not in a good way. It was a long-form podcast appearance where Caviezel started talking about something unexpected. He described, in detail, a theory that children were being trafficked not just for abuse, but for the harvesting of chemicals from their blood. A theory widely discredited and linked to the QAnon movement. Within hours, that clip was being shared by conspiracy theorists across the internet, and then, it vanished. The original interview was taken down. Snippets still exist on fringe platforms, but the mainstream video was scrubbed. No official statement was ever made, no correction, no apology, just silence. Why would the studio erase a promotional interview? Because in that moment, the film's message shifted from raise awareness to promote fringe beliefs, and that made people nervous. Behind-the-scenes clips that got pulled. When the DVD version of the movie was released, fans noticed something odd. The special features section, the part that usually includes deleted scenes, bloopers, and behind-the-scenes footage was almost empty. A few interviews, a short message from the director, but nothing else. No commentary tracks, no making-of documentary, no footage from the original shoots in South America. Even though early press releases had promised exclusive field insights, what happened to that material? According to a former crew member, who spoke anonymously, some of the deleted scenes showed real survivors recounting their stories, but their identities weren't protected. No faces blurred, no names changed. Legal teams allegedly stepped in, warning that releasing this footage could put people at risk, or worse, expose the production to lawsuits, so it was buried. And that raises another question. If the film was supposed to honor real survivors, why was their protection treated as an afterthought? Deleted posts and scrubbed tweets. It wasn't just videos that disappeared. Online, dozens of social media posts tied to Sound of Freedom were deleted within weeks of the premiere. Some included off-the-cuff statements from people involved in the production. Things like, "This film will expose the deep state's control of child trafficking. Hollywood elites don't want you to see this. We're taking down the satanic networks." These weren't made by random fans. They were posted by verified accounts tied to the film's cast and marketing team. Then, after the movie hit mainstream success, they were wiped clean. Why? Because the film had moved from fringe project to box office contender. It was suddenly being watched by people outside the echo chamber, and the team behind it likely realized, if you want legitimacy, you can't go full conspiracy. Not publicly, at least. So they cleaned house. But digital footprints are hard to erase completely. The actor who spoke to Freely, Jim Caviezel, became the face of the movement behind Sound of Freedom, but his press appearances quickly spiraled. In one live Q&A after a screening, he claimed that the US government was involved in child trafficking, and that military teams had been rescuing thousands of children in tunnels beneath American cities. No evidence was offered. No sources cited, just a chilling statement, delivered with confidence. Clips of this talk were uploaded, then taken down. Even supporters of the film began to worry. As one fan wrote on Reddit, "I believe in the cause, but some of these claims are too wild. It's hurting the credibility." Eventually, Caviezel's public appearances were scaled back. He stopped doing interviews. His social media went quiet. No official reason was given, but insiders suggest the producers wanted to separate the film from the messenger. Because when your lead actor starts sounding like a conspiracy theorist on live TV, you've got a problem. What the press was told not to ask during the movie's press junkets. Several journalists came forward saying they were handed strict guidelines, a list of topics to avoid, questions about Caviezel's views on Kevin, the real backgrounds of certain producers' financial ties between the film and right-wing donors. Missing footage from early cuts of the movie, one journalist said. "We were told to keep it positive, focus on the message, and avoid anything political." It felt less like a press event and more like a PR firewall. And yet, the film itself had already become deeply political. It was being embraced by conservative influencers, church groups, and anti-government movements, while being criticized or ignored by mainstream Hollywood. That tension was growing, and the producers were clearly trying to manage it by erasing the rough edges. So what's being hidden? At this point, you might be wondering, why does any of this matter? Why care about deleted clips or missing interviews? Here's why. Because Sound of Freedom isn't just a movie anymore. It became a symbol, a rallying cry. And when a symbol is carefully edited, it's usually because someone is shaping a narrative. A safe narrative. One that avoids messy details, like the questionable beliefs of its lead actor, or the unverified claims tied to its promotion, or the missing footage that might raise too many questions. It's not just about what they show you, it's about what they won't. And when the goal is to make you feel like you're re-seeing the whole truth, but you're only getting part of it, that's manipulation, even if the cause is noble. Behind the curtain look. No one's saying the film's creators had evil intentions. In fact, many probably thought they were doing good. But good intentions don't erase the need for honesty. If you're telling the world's darkest truths, you can't afford to hide your own. So when footage disappears, when statements are erased, when survivors are left out, and when interviews go silent, it raises the question, whose truth are we being told, and who's making the cuts? Chapter 4. The viral movement behind the movie. When Sound of Freedom first premiered, it wasn't just a film, it was a call to arms. Audiences didn't just watch it, they stood up in theaters, clapped, cried, and chanted slogans. Online communities exploded. Hashtags trended globally. A movement was born. But here's the dark truth. While some were genuinely moved by the film's message, others saw an opportunity. This chapter explores how Sound of Freedom became the centerpiece of a viral and deeply political movement, one that blended truth with fiction, facts with fear, and weaponized pain for power. Angel Studios and the power of crowdfunding. Let's start with the studio. Sound of Freedom was distributed by Angel Studios, a Utah-based company best known for The Chosen, a Christian drama series. But Angel didn't fund the film traditionally. Instead, they launched a crowdfunding campaign, asking ordinary people to invest in the release, and it worked. They raised over $5 million from 7,000 individual investors, breaking records for an indie film. Supporters were told they weren't just backing a movie, they were helping save the children. It was charity wrapped in entertainment. But here's the uncomfortable question. When you blend activism with investment, who's really profiting? Because while many donors thought they were fighting trafficking, they were also handing over cash to a private studio, one that would go on to make millions. And some of those early investors, connected to political PACs and religious lobbying groups. This wasn't just about movies anymore. Pay it forward, or pressure tactic. Angel Studios didn't just raise money, they engineered virality. They launched a pay it forward campaign, where viewers could buy extra tickets for strangers. At face value, this looked generous, inspirational even. But some said it felt like pressure. Theaters reported unusual behavior. Entire screenings were bought out, yet seats sat empty. Influencers urged followers to buy a dozen tickets even if you don't go. Some churches bought out every seat in their cities. Online, users claimed the campaign was being gamed, with people buying bulk tickets, then using the numbers to inflate box office reports. The goal, make Sound of Freedom look like a cultural phenomenon, and it worked. The film beat out Indiana Jones on July 4th weekend. But when a film's success relies more on marketing mechanics than audience demand, is it still a grassroots movement, or is it manufactured momentum? The hashtag war around the time of release, the hashtag Sound of Freedom, exploded across platforms. But it didn't just trend, it became territory. Critics of the film were flooded with replies calling them pedophile defenders, deep state shills, or worse. Social media turned into a battlefield. Accounts that raised legitimate questions about the film's funding or accuracy were mass-reported and suspended. Others noticed that any negative reviews on YouTube or IMDb were instantly downvoted into oblivion. And behind many of these attacks were bot accounts, some traced to foreign networks. Yes, foreign. Cybersecurity researchers found signs of coordinated activity promoting the film, echoing phrases like, "The media is hiding this. They don't want you to see the truth. Expose the elites." This was more than fandom. It was information warfare, and it wasn't organic. Political hijacking. Not long after its viral breakout, Sound of Freedom was picked up by political figures, especially in the US. Senators, governors, and presidential hopefuls began praising the film during rallies. One congressman even held a screening on Capitol Hill. The message was clear. Watching this movie was no longer entertainment, it was a political act. And then came the claims. Some politicians used the film to push controversial legislation, linking it to border security, immigration reform, or attacks on Hollywood. But there was a problem. Sound of Freedom is about child trafficking in South America, with no direct connection to immigration policy. Still, facts didn't matter. The symbolism did. The film became shorthand for fighting evil, and anyone who questioned it was painted as part of the problem. That kind of binary thinking, us versus them, is dangerous. It closes the door on real dialogue and real solutions. The churches and the crusade religious groups were also quick to embrace Sound of Freedom. Churches booked private screenings. Pastors preached entire sermons around the film's message. and in many cases, it was sincere. Child trafficking is a horrific global issue, and faith communities have a long history of frontline work to combat it. But something changed. Some churches began linking the film to spiritual warfare, suggesting that watching Sound of Freedom was a divine mission, a battle between good and evil, God and Satan. In fringe congregations, the rhetoric got even more extreme. The elites are harvesting children. Hollywood is satanic. Only God's army can stop this. And yes, these were direct quotes. In this version of the movement, Sound of Freedom wasn't a film, it was a weapon. One that justified radical beliefs, and sometimes, radical action. Grifters in the dark where there's fear, there's money to be made. After the film's success, a flood of new anti-trafficking influencers emerged online. People with no background in law enforcement or victim services suddenly declared themselves experts. They sold merch, ran donation campaigns, hosted expensive rescue workshops, and while some were sincere, others were exposed as frauds. One influencer raised thousands for an alleged mission in Colombia, but was later seen vacationing in Ibiza. Another ran a non-profit with 0 verified rescues and no financial transparency. Meanwhile, real organizations that help survivors, the ones doing quiet, dangerous work every day, were being drowned out. Because the truth is, pain sells, and Sound of Freedom had opened a market. When a message becomes a mirror, the story Sound of Freedom tells is powerful, necessary. It shows a real crisis many people would rather ignore. But what happened after the credits rolled is just as important. Because once a story becomes a movement, once it starts pulling in money, power, and belief, it's no longer just about truth. It's about control. Who controls the message? Who profits from the outrage? Who turns suffering into social capital? And who's using your outrage to push something you didn't ask for? Chapter 5. The truth about Tim Ballard in Sound of Freedom. Tim Ballard is the hero. He is portrayed as a fearless federal agent who quits his job to rescue children from sex traffickers in South America, a modern-day crusader. But the real Tim Ballard, he's not a Hollywood script. And over the past year, the carefully crafted image of Ballard has begun to collapse. Behind the marketing, behind the applause, behind the child-saving legend, is a man now surrounded by serious allegations, and questions no one in the movement wants to answer. This chapter breaks the silence. The rise of a savior. Ballard built his reputation as the founder of Operation Underground Railroad, OUR, a non-profit launched in 2013 to rescue trafficked children around the world. OUR claimed to carry out daring raids, working with local police in places like Haiti, Colombia, and Thailand. Videos on their YouTube channel showed masked agents, body armor, and high-tech gear. The message: we go where others won't. Ballard was everywhere. Fox News, Glenn Beck's show, CPACs, Mormon conferences, even White House meetings during the Trump administration. He spoke of rescuing hundreds of children, of personally kicking down doors, of God sending him on this mission. And then, Sound of Freedom was made, starring Jim Caviezel, a fellow believer in spiritual warfare, who called Ballard a modern-day prophet. But as Ballard's legend grew, so did the doubts. Fabricated rescues. In 2020, investigative journalists began digging into Ballard's claims. A bombshell report from Vice News revealed that many of OUR's most high-profile rescues were either exaggerated or completely fabricated. In some cases, Ballard allegedly took credit for operations carried out entirely by foreign police. In others, he posted videos of rescues that were actually staged stings, with no traffickers arrested and no children removed from danger. Former OUR employees told reporters, "We were encouraged to dramatize outcomes. There were incentives to inflate the numbers. The mission became more about optics than impact." It didn't stop there. Colombian officials went on record saying OUR operations in their country had put real children at risk, with poor planning and reckless tactics. In one instance, a rescue mission was organized around a documentary film crew, endangering victims for the sake of storytelling. And yet, Ballard continued to raise millions. Financial questions and lack of transparency. OUR marketed itself as a donor-driven non-profit. But in 2021, watchdog groups began questioning where the money was really going. Internal financial records showed large, unexplained payouts, including payments to companies owned by Ballard himself. The organization resisted calls for transparency. Their financial disclosures were often incomplete, delayed, or inconsistent with IRS standards. When pressed, Ballard offered spiritual justifications. God called me to lead this fight. I don't answer to critics. I answer to Him. But donors began pulling support. Longtime allies distanced themselves, and under increasing scrutiny, Ballard quietly stepped down as CEO of OUR in 2023. Publicly, he claimed it was to focus on other projects. Privately, insiders said the real reason was darker. Sexual misconduct allegations in September 2023. Everything changed. Multiple women came forward accusing Ballard of sexual misconduct, including former OUR operatives who worked closely with him during overseas missions. The details were disturbing. According to reports, Ballard allegedly pressured female operatives to pose as his wife during missions, and under this guise, engaged in sexually inappropriate behavior. Some described situations where he justified inappropriate touching or sharing hotel rooms by claiming it was part of the operation, that it was necessary to convince traffickers they were a real couple. But victims say it crossed a line, and that Ballard used his authority and religious language to manipulate them. One former colleague described him as a man hiding behind a Bible, using God as cover for his ego and appetites. Ballard denied all allegations, but an internal Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints investigation later excommunicated him, a rare and serious move for a prominent public figure. That silence from supporters was deafening. Political ambitions and ego. Shortly before the scandal broke, Ballard was considering a Senate run in Utah. He was backed by high-profile conservatives and media personalities, who saw him as a hero-turned-politician. Ballard frequently claimed he was called by God to run for office, saying he would bring up Warrior Hart to Washington. But as the allegations mounted, those plans crumbled. Endorsements were pulled. Campaign infrastructure disbanded. And by late 2023, Ballard was politically radioactive. Some say the Senate dreams weren't about service, but ego. One former insider put it bluntly: he started believing the hype. He thought he was the movie. Where is he now? Since stepping down, Ballard has remained mostly out of public view. He occasionally appears on fringe podcasts or conservative radio, denying wrongdoing and framing himself as a victim of the deep state. Angel Studios, for their part, has distanced themselves from him. In a carefully worded statement, they acknowledged troubling reports and said Sound of Freedom was bigger than one man, but they never removed the film, never issued a real apology, and never updated viewers with the truth about the man they portrayed as a savior. Why? Because the myth still sells. The damage done, the fallout from Ballard's unraveling, isn't just reputational, it's practical. Donations to legitimate trafficking non-profits have dropped. Survivors say the film distorted what trafficking really looks like, leading to less trust in real rescue programs. Law enforcement now has to clarify the trafficking isn't about cartels stealing kids from the suburbs, but far more complex issues like family abuse, online grooming, and poverty. And for the women who say Ballard harmed them, there's still no justice, no court case, no public reckoning, only silence. The lie in the light. Tim Ballard crafted a legend. He stood in the spotlight, bathed in applause, portrayed as a man who would do what no one else dared. But behind the light, there was always a shadow, a hunger for fame, a willingness to blur truth for attention, and, according to some, a darkness much deeper than anyone wanted to believe. This isn't just about one man. It's about how easily a narrative can be sold, if it looks righteous enough, and how, in our desperation for heroes, we sometimes embrace false ones. Chapter 6. Why you were meant to forget. There's a reason stories vanish. Not every truth fits the shape of a hero's journey. And when it comes to child trafficking, some truths make too many powerful people uncomfortable. After the release of Sound of Freedom, a wave of public attention surged toward child trafficking awareness. People donated. They shared links. They tweeted hashtags. For a moment, the world seemed united in outrage. But then, the silence came. Videos were removed. Journalists who pushed too far were quietly reassigned. Non-profits issued strange public statements. Timelines were corrected. Certain survivors were asked not to speak at events. Interviews were cancelled last minute. Documents went missing. It was like the lights were turned off on purpose. Let's talk about media complicity. When a film like Sound of Freedom becomes a cultural flashpoint, it forces networks and studios to pick a side. On the surface, it seems like a fight against evil. But behind closed doors, networks run on relationships with governments, donors, advertisers. Certain angles just aren't profitable. So what happens? The story is sanitized. Key voices are removed. Talking points become safer. Narratives shift. For example, major news outlets once praised Operation Underground Railroad. Later, when internal investigations surfaced about misconduct and staged rescues, those same outlets quietly deleted or edited past coverage. Not out of ethics, but optics. Even tech platforms joined in. Search terms became harder to find. Algorithmic suppression buried more critical content beneath layers of reaction videos and unrelated media. Why? Because powerful institutions don't like being questioned. There's also selective outrage. Audiences were shown one version of the problem, a noble mission to rescue children in exotic countries. It was easy to support. It didn't demand reflection. But what if the same horrors are happening in suburban neighborhoods, in church basements, in youth programs with million-dollar donors? Suddenly, the narrative becomes inconvenient. People like stories with villains they can't recognize, not the ones sitting next to them. That's why films like this often exclude domestic cases, even when they're statistically more common. It keeps the story simple. Another issue, emotional fatigue. The first time someone learns about trafficking, they're shocked. The 10th time, they scroll past. Outrage becomes background noise. So media strategists learn to weaponize that first moment. They push a peak of emotion, and then they drop it, quickly, before people ask too many questions. The result? You remember the headline. And soon, you forget the headline too. Let's also address what wasn't shown. Survivor networks, independent journalists, and even law enforcement insiders have spoken about the real scope of these crimes. Not in whispery conspiracy channels, but in court documents and official hearings. Yet their words rarely make it to prime time. Why? Because there's no room for their story when the spotlight is on one version of heroism, especially when that heroism is tied to profitable brands, political agendas, or film studios. When survivors say, "This movie doesn't represent us," they're not denying abuse, they're exposing erasure. So what do we do with this? We ask better questions. We stop treating every polished narrative as the full truth. And we remember, some stories aren't buried because they were lies. They're buried because they were true. And truth unchecked is dangerous. If Sound of Freedom made you uncomfortable, what they left out would have made you sick. This isn't just about a movie. It's about how Isley was shown one version of horror and taught to stop looking once the credits roll. But the real horror doesn't end. It hides. And unless we keep digging, it stays hidden forever. If you want more stories like this, the ones they try to bury, hit that like button. Subscribe to uncover the rest of the truth. And let me know in the comments, what do you think they're not telling us?